1 grants women the same rights, legal rights as men. And that's according to the World Bank's latest Women, Business, and the Law report. It's little wonder then that today 1 in 10 women in the world live in extreme poverty. It's a number that's only expected to climb due to climate change, leaving roughly 200 million more women and girls hungry, and that's twice as many as men. But closing the gender gaps that exist won't just help women. It's estimated that closing existing gender gaps will actually boost global GDP by 20%. So what we hope to do today is to go beyond these statistics to learn more about all that we can do to advance opportunities and rights for women around the world. We'll hear from leaders in government, multilateral institutions, civil society, leaders and others about concrete steps they're taking in their own work to eliminate discrimination and address systemic barriers that keep women from reaching their full potential. We hope to inspire action with these conversations, not just by those of you in the room here at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, but also by those of you watching the live stream. So thank you for joining us. Just a couple of our segments will also be recorded for FP's award-winning show, The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women, reaching and hopefully also inspiring tens of thousands of more people around the world to act. Before we kick off the formal program, I want to share just a few housekeeping notes. If you're in the room here with us, please do silence your phones and keep the conversations to a minimum when speakers are on the stage, just to make sure that we're moving the program along. However, we do want to hear from you, our audience, both online and in person during the program. So you can submit questions via our event website, which is foreignpolicy.com/events, and look for Her Power at the top. Our moderators will take questions throughout the program, so please feel free to share what you're hearing and learning through questions, also on social media. We want to hear from you. And finally, I want to take a moment to thank our partners, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Northwestern University's Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. We couldn't do this work without them, so thank you very much. And of course, we're also grateful that you all decided to join us and take time out of your busy schedules to connect with each other, to learn from each other. And so with that, I hope you enjoy the program, and we will enjoy for the next few hours and come back for closing remarks. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Stacey Dixon, for a conversation with FP's National Security and Intelligence reporter, Amy McKinnon, on trust and transparency in the intelligence community.
Thank you everyone for joining us today on this beautiful day in this fantastic space. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Dixon. We have 15 minutes and I have about 500 questions for you, as I'm sure everyone else here does as well. So I won't waste any time in getting started. As this is Her Power, I want to talk first about the connection between gender and national security. Research is really stunning on this question and really alarming. In countries where the larger the gender gap is in countries, and this is defined by experiences and opportunities for women, the more likely a country is to be involved in violent conflict. And the higher levels of violence against women, the more likely a country is to not comply with international norms and treaty agreements. Given this incredible and very alarming connection, how do you factor this into your thinking and your work in the IC?
And I think people would be surprised to know that we do factor it in very much, because we know that women's involvement in society has a huge impact on the development, on economics, as well as on what the foreign policy perspectives are of the nation. And we do it in a couple of ways. And probably the most visible way that you would see is we put every year out a a trends report. And the trends report looks at possible futures and gets society as well as our community to think about what could be happening in the future. And it has a section in there on women, women's rights, women's roles, and how we might see that developing further on. We also have done a report on just the future of human rights more broadly, but women's rights and specifically going forward. And so we are looking at this very much to make sure that we're not missing out on important trends in any countries, in any regions, because as you said, it really does impact the stability as well as the prosperity of those nations.
That's incredible. I want to turn now to Ukraine and talk about in the run-up to the Russian invasion in 2022, I think one of the really startling and interesting roles that the U.S. played was the rapid declassification of intelligence and the sharing of that with allies and partners, but also with the public, really, sounding the alarm about Russia's intentions and what ultimately did happen. Can you talk a bit about the genesis of this? I mean, how did this decision come around to go so public with these warnings, and what was the thinking behind it?
And I'll start with saying it was the administration's interest in making sure that we could have this conversation more publicly with allies, with partners, and with the public. And so there's always been a history of the intelligence community declassifying things, but to your point, not only was it more rapid, but it was far more expansive than we've done in the past. And it was so that we could get the world to see the potential of what was going to happen, and hopefully getting allies aligned and seeing what our intelligence was saying, prevent something that unfortunately we weren't able to prevent. But knowing that Russia, and Putin in particular, has a history of using disinformation and misinformation to justify activities like invasions, we wanted to make sure that the world remembered that as well. And so talking about the fact that you could see false flag operations, you could see statements coming out of Russia to try to justify these things, that we saw this build up that was unexplained, and that others were seeing, but may have interpreted it in different ways. And so part of it was to help our conversation with allies and partners, but the rest of it was also like, if we can't prevent this from happening, if this isn't a deterrent, and talking about it more broadly, how do we at least educate more people so that they will be able to judge for themselves what they're hearing and what they're seeing.
And how novel was this approach?
The quantity of things that were declassified was very new for us. It sort of put us into a new realm of having to think about our intelligence from the moment we collect it to the moment we write about it, in terms of it may need to be needed for a different, it may need to be needed to be shared more broadly. So how do you think about that as you're writing about it? Don't just write the classified part, write something that actually can be shared at different levels. And so that is something that our community is trying to adjust to and figure out how to do that the best. Because there's enough to just write about in the classified realm, but now to have to also be thoughtful about that up in advance. It's a mind shift.
Obviously the warnings up until the invasion were, tragically for Ukraine, incredibly spot on. Russia did ultimately launch a full-scale invasion. But one aspect to the warnings that was off the mark was how the war would unfold from the invasion. And whenever I speak to military analysts, the first thing they say is war is inherently unpredictable. Sure. So I appreciate this is a very difficult thing to foresee, but what we were hearing from the administration was that Kiev could fall in a matter of days. There really was this expectation that Russia would go in and take Ukraine, or at least a large chunk of it, incredibly quickly, which ultimately, 2 years in, still has not come to pass. Why was this expectation off the mark? And what is the kind of process in the IC if a prediction has failed to pass?
Not only is it difficult to predict militarily what can happen, but the sort of the will to fight and the public support are very difficult to analyze in advance. And I think we've seen some examples of times when we sort of had an expectation that hasn't resulted in the outcome being what we thought it would be. And a lot of times it comes down to just the nuances of what people will do and where people are pushed to limits and what choices they end up making. So we continue to try to learn from this so that we can be better in the future and provide these perspectives to policymakers. It's always something that we say is a possibility, but clearly it was not what we expected in this case. And you mentioned 2 years plus in, we're still going, and you still see a lot of support.
I suppose you're trying to analyze the extremes of human behavior, both in the invading force, but also amongst the Ukrainians.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
One last question on Ukraine. One of the other interesting things in the run-up to the invasion was the amount of information made available through open source data and by private companies going straight to journalists and straight to the public. A great example of this is Maxar Images, which has incredible satellite capability and was sending satellite images of Russian tanks, of Russian troops, straight into the inboxes of journalists. And then, of course, you also have groups like Bellingcat, which have made incredible use of social media, hacked and leaked emails to track Russian spies across Europe. How does this change the way you work in the IC when the public and the media now has so much information at its fingertips, but also other governments and also non-state actors as well?
It's a great way to phrase the question, too, because we have seen over the course of many conflicts how important it is for the public to sort of be involved and to be able to see things for themselves. And so I applaud those out there that are sharing things broadly. We in our community have over the course of the last decade. I mean, if you look back in the past, we were criticized for not being more open to using open source information. I think now, like many in the world, we see the power of it, and we're trying to build infrastructures that allow us to use it effectively, using our trade craft, using the way that we would approach analysts. We're not approaching it any differently because it's a different kind of data source. We want to make sure that we're approaching it the same way we would approach the other data that we collect. That's been a little bit of a shift. We're trying to build it up, but it's something that our analysts, our collectors are very much taking into consideration these days, and there's a hunger for it. At the same time, we also know that there is a lot of concern with the intelligence community's use of information like this, whether it's open source or commercially acquired, and we're trying to address that, trying to make sure people know that no, we're following the laws. What underpins this is the values and the principles that America, espouse. So how do you make sure that we can raise the trust by the public and by policymakers and by lawmakers so that we can have access to this information? Because to your point, Amy, everyone else does. Do you want to disadvantage the government by not allowing us to have the same information that adversaries might have? And it's true that, yes, the government can do a lot with this information, but we also are putting frameworks in place to make sure that people can understand what we are and aren't doing, and we hope to publicize more of that in the near future. Mm-hmm.
How do you integrate, open source data sets into the IC whilst maintaining those legal, ethical, and normative standards that you mentioned earlier?
Part of it is making sure that we've got there's a lot that you can do with open source out in sort of unclassified realms. Mm-hmm. A lot of what we do is in our classified systems, and we don't want to replicate the internet and bring everything in. And so how do you make sure that you're able to leverage the analysis of both places? And it does take some more sophisticated IT thinkers to be able to figure out how to do that. But that's exactly what we want to do. Leverage as much of the open source information as we can, use it to supplement on the one hand, but it can also be a starting point where you're then adding in classified information later. So it really depends on the topic, whether we start with the open source or whether we start with the classified, but we're trying to be able to do it a lot more effectively than we've done in the past.
I mean, part of what has fueled this explosion in open source research, both in the public sphere and the media, is just new technologies available, leading to an explosion in data. According to one analysis I found, each year we generate, as a world, 500 million tweets, 294 billion emails, half of which I feel like are sitting unread in my inbox.
And mine.
Right. 4 million gigabytes of Facebook data and 65 billion WhatsApp messages. How has this just explosion in the amount of data changed the work of the IC? Because when I think, a lot of us think about intelligence agencies, you think about finding information, right? Our picture we have in our minds is very framed by Hollywood, by the Cold War, covert operations. Now, in some ways, you have the opposite problem. It's finding the needle in the needle stack, as I've heard people say. So how does this change your job of managing and just sorting through all of this information?
It's exactly as you described it. We have to be able to go in and very quickly triage through a lot of information. So some of it is using the tools that are out there, the artificial intelligence tools for summarization. Mm-hmm. But we want to get beyond that and try to figure out, what is the power of these tools and how can we have them help our analysts point to the things that they need to sort of focus on first. How do we ensure that we can move through the data really quickly so that they can spend time thinking and being thoughtful about it, and they're not spending all their time just searching and seeking and triaging. So we really see a good interface and partnership between the humans and the machines, the human-machine teaming, to be able to do these kinds of things. But we're very excited about the possibility, but it is daunting when you think of how much information is out there and how very little of it probably will be useful, but the things that are will be critically important to make sure they get into our cycles and our systems.
I mean, you mentioned AI there. I mean, how is AI, I mean, it's going to change the way we all work, but how is it changing the way that you work within the intelligence community?
I've already seen really good uses of algorithms and tools that are being applied to these really large sets of just text information, for example. How do you go through and summarize a lot of content to know where you should focus yourself? I've also seen it used to good effect in the machine learning to good effect on images. You know, looking through, trying to find particular things in the images. Machines are really good at finding anomalous things in large data sets, so being able to use it that way, and a couple of our agencies are focused on that. Being able to also use it for translations to get us the basics of what people are talking about or what the languages are saying when it's not in English. Tools can help us with that because there's not enough linguists in the world to be able to cover everything that's happening. So how do we more effectively leverage technology to help us do our missions?
You know, as we mentioned, AI has so much potential to revolutionize the way we all work. I also assume that it's going to revolutionize the way that adversaries work and non-state actors. And I'm particularly interested in that non-state part because there's a lot discussed about how Russia might use this for disinformation, you know, the race with China for the competitive edge in AI. But what about terror groups, gangs, cyber groups? What are your concerns about how they may harness the power of these new technologies to revolutionize the way they work?
We've talked a lot about the democratization of technology and how really it's out there for everyone and not just for those who are able to develop it in their own countries or in their own organizations. It's worrisome because I think that those of us who are creating the technology are also thinking about it through our ethical principles and trying to figure out what the guardrails are and the biases. And if someone's handed technology that they didn't develop, I don't see the same sort of thoughtfulness put up. And so being willing to use it in situations where we wouldn't use it, being willing to use it, you know, as a decider of whether someone's life is taken or not. I could see others doing that long before the United States would do anything like that. And that it can definitely be very, very worrisome. You see it a little bit in the proliferation of UAVs and how many unmanned aerial vehicles are out there being used for conflicts. Same thing with AI. It's low barriers to entry. If you have access to the internet, you can have access to very, very powerful models that can help you create content that can, you know, stir up the tensions within other societies like our own. And I'm absolutely certain that would be very attractive for someone to use to include terrorist groups and others.
And just quickly, we have a minute left. What do you see as some of the best approaches to kind of keeping AI as a force for good rather than falling into those kind of uses?
Part of it is making sure that international communities are talking about it, that we're talking about how do we create standards that we're all following, where do we keep the weights of the models that form the basis of these algorithms, how do we talk about sort of those guardrails and building in anti-bias checks for the algorithms that we're developing. You see a lot of researchers talking about those things, and now it's a matter of if we're going to make the algorithms available for more people, we probably need to build them in from the beginning. We can't assume that others are going to add them afterwards. And so how do we as communities doing this kind of work figure out how to sort of future-proof the fact that they're going to get out there in the wild and others are going to use them and may not have the same sort of protections in their minds before they use such technology. But I'm optimistic. I think the researchers out there are being very thoughtful about it.
Well, thank you for ending our conversation on an optimistic note. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Amy. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Please now welcome to the stage Congresswoman Young Kim for a conversation with FP's executive editor, Amelia Lester, on advancing opportunities for women.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Representative Kim. It's so great to be here with you today on a beautiful Washington morning. We've got a lot to talk about. I want to sum up all the many facets of your identity in a sentence. I'm going to give it a go. You're an immigrant, small business owner, community leader, former California Assemblywoman, mother and grandmother. It's clear you've achieved so much in so many realms, but I did want to start with politics. In 2020, you were one of the first 3 Korean American women elected to Congress. You won in a district that was expected to go to the Democratic Party. In fact, Joe Biden won that district by more than 10 points. What do you attribute your success in that race to?
Being a woman. Hard work. I am really honored to be one of the first Korean American and one of the first 2 Korean American Republican women at that. This is not a partisan conversation, but I have to say that because I represent a state that is very blue. But I also had the opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity, to work in the field in that same congressional district, because I worked for a former chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ed Royce. And so I feel like I knew that district when he retired at the end of 2018. I told myself, my time has come. At such time as this, young Kim, go to Washington, D.C. and represent the district. So I attribute that to, 1, being connected to the district, knowing the district, and again, being a woman naturally makes you a consensus builder, problem solver, and we are multitaskers and we can get things done. So despite the fact the district was very, very blue district and a blue state, I think I attribute hard work to getting here when I did in 2020.
Well, now that you're here, you are chairwoman of the Indo-Pacific Subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Very busy part of the world, as we were talking about backstage, though there's a lot more going on in other parts of the world that's maybe distracted us lately. But I know that you've been taking some trips to the Indo-Pacific, some CODELs, and you just returned from South Korea 2 weeks ago. Tell us how those travels in the region have shaped or perhaps even changed your agenda in terms of foreign affairs.
So, my priority and my focus as the chairwoman of the Indo-Pacific Subcommittee is to meet with our counterparts and our partners in the Indo-Pacific region, talking about the common threat that we are facing. And that comes from China, CCP, whose goal has been made very, very clear. They want to be the economic and military superpower. So my challenge was to go around and meet with our counterparts and get some assurance. Will you stand with the United States if our other strongest economic partner, like Taiwan, is attacked by China? Because Xi Jinping's goal goes through taking over Taiwan by 2027. We have an obligation to deliver the weapons that Taiwan purchased and already paid for, which we haven't done. So 1 is to ensure if United States cannot fulfill that obligation before that 2027, will our partners like Japan, South Korea be able to help us and protect our strongest ally? Because security assurance to Taiwan is critically important because our national security is at stake. Remember, TSMC is in Taiwan, and so they're trying to invest more in the United States, and as you know, they are doing that in Arizona. If something happens, Taiwan, being like over 90% of the producer of the semiconductor, everything that you see, you guys are taking notes on your phone, taking pictures with that. All of this will be affected, and our economy will be affected. Our national security will be affected. And by not standing and showing the leadership in the world will also affect our U.S.'s ability to be perceived as a leader in the global stage. So that is very important. So our relationship with our allies in the Indo-Pacific is critically important. So I also had that conversation in South Korea. That was a repeat trip to South Korea. And I also understand that they're really, Japan, in the case of Japan, they have 2% of GDP in the defense budget. That is also very, very exciting for me to hear. Our other partners are doing that. South Korea, they just had a National Assembly. But as far as their foreign policy will not change because President Yoon's, the first half of his administration was all focused on building relationship with the foreign countries and especially with the United States, trilateral relationship with Japan, and then they are really becoming the security partner with other partners in the Pacific area.
So with what you classify as this sort of imminent threat from China and President Xi, how do you balance the need to reassure allies in the Indo-Pacific and specifically to equip Taiwan for what you see as a coming battle with China, with the US's other obligations to allies who are also fighting wars in other places? I'm thinking here specifically of Ukraine and Israel.
As you know, South Korea has stepped up, and they have continued to provide the support that Ukraine needs. They may not have done it directly, but they have done that through United States, and we have transferred that to Ukraine. So we need to continue to provide the support for Ukraine, but also to Israel and in the Pacific, specifically Taiwan. And I'm really glad that this week, I hope at the latest by Saturday, we're going to be working and passing on those foreign aid bills. And let's hope that gets done, because it sends a very strong message that we are taking decisive action to protect and stand with our allies and partners.
Do you feel frustrated by how slow and arduous that process has been on passing that?
Yes.
And what do you attribute the slowness to?
You can count on me to be able to get things done. I can't say the same thing. There is only few vocal voices. So we had this package. I told the leadership and Speaker Johnson that I don't care whether it comes as a package, foreign aid to Ukraine, Israel, or in the Pacific, or do it as an individual aid. Just let us vote on it and have an opportunity for every member to vote their district. There may be some people who oppose aid to Ukraine. There are some people on the left that oppose aid to Israel. For whatever reasons, they are voting for their district. But one thing is clear, we are all in agreement in providing support for Taiwan. So again, that allows every member to vote their district, vote for their conscience. It is the right thing to do, and on that, I give a lot of credit to Speaker Johnson, because he said he's not going to be threatened by one member, MTV, if you do this. We have to do this because it's the right thing to do, and I hope there are more women legislators like me who would tell the Speaker and the leadership, we have your back. Woman will protect you.
Let's talk about one other foreign policy issue before we wrap up, and that is securing the border. I know that's a priority for you. Talk to us about how you're tackling partisanship on this issue in order to make progress.
So, because the situation of the border is really more dire and it's really worse than what it appears.
As a result, humanitarian dimensions or
the border crisis, right. Yes. What we're seeing at the border is really bad, so much so that my colleagues on the left are now taking the issue very seriously, right? So we need to address the border crisis, but at the same time, we need to look at it from the immigration perspective. Look, I'm an immigrant. I came from South Korea through the legal way. So we need to separate the border crisis and also the immigration discussion and the conversation that we're having. And I believe I bring a very unique perspective We need to address the issue from not undermining the legal immigration. The people that are crossing the border, unless we have some sort of a reform that will allow more people to come here legally, they are coming here to live a better life and live the American dream that like most of us did. But we need to tackle that issue in a compassionate and fair way, but do it in a way that doesn't undermine the legal immigration. So I want to, again, border crisis is really serious. We have a legislation that Congress passed in the House of Representatives. We talk about it, but again, we have to allow those who wants to come and live the American dream to be able to do it. Also, there are different visa categories that we need to strengthen, such as, we just talked about South Korea, right? South Korea is one of the countries that have free trade agreements with the United States, but unlike Canada and Singapore and other countries where we already have FTAs, South Korea was not allowed to have the separate 15,000 visa categories to be able to bring their high-level skilled workforce to be able to establish their companies. So that's what I'm working on right now, partner with Korea Act, E4 visa. So we have different types, H1B visa, L1 visas, E1, E4, whatever, J1, B1. There's all kinds of visa categories. Those are all legal way of bringing people here for family petition, employment-based, or even just for exchange programs. But if you do this and do it in a fair and compassionate way, but also do it in the legal way, I think we can solve a lot of problems that we see at the southern border.
It sounds like you want to expand avenues to legal immigration.
Yes.
And that's another priority for you. I wonder, given that English is your second language and you were born in South Korea, how do you think that these experiences have given you a unique worldview in Congress?
Definitely unique perspective, because look, I just finished elementary school in South Korea. I was a young girl, so my recollection of Korea is very, I wasn't versed on the foreign policy issues when I left. But I went to Guam, which is territory of the United States, and finished my junior high school there. And I saw how our military base is really stationed strategically in order to respond should there be conflict around the world. And then I came to Hawaii to finish my high school education, and then came to California, where I am right now. And so you can see, just going through different places as a young girl coming here, and then as an adult, now I get to serve in the United States Congress, serving on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, chairing the Indo-Pacific Subcommittee, and also my background as a small business owner and serving as a controller for a bank corporation doing merger and acquisitions. All these brings me a very unique perspective. So that is how I shaped how I approached the relations with our foreign countries, and then also working on the domestic issues, especially in the areas of small business. I understand how it is very difficult for especially women-owned businesses. That is on the rise, by the way. More so than women-owned businesses were, according to the Wells Fargo Bank's recent study, it probably doubled than the male counterparts. And between 2022 and 2023, I think it probably more than like 4.5 times more women-owned businesses are created. So that's how I just view all domestic and foreign issues from that lens. Remember, Margaret Thatcher always says, if you want anything said, ask a man. If you want anything done, ask a woman. And I always live by that quote.
Well, Representative Kim, we've covered immigration, small business ownership, AUKUS, Indo-Pacific. It's clear that you bring a lot of really unique perspectives to Congress, and we thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you.
And now please welcome Senator Tammy Duckworth to the stage for a conversation on women's rights.
To meet you. Hi, everybody.
Thank you so much for being here, Senator Duckworth. We've actually met once before on Zoom during COVID times when we did Her Power from our living rooms. And
Yes.
It's so nice to be here now in person with you again. Last year, you traveled to Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines with a congressional delegation as part of your work on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and with the Senate Armed Services Committee. You were born in Bangkok, but I'm sure that you saw things on that particular trip which really stayed with you. Was there maybe a single encounter that you can recall that stood out?
I think it is the investments that we're making. So in the Philippines, it was my first time back in the Philippines in a long time, and I had some great conversations. In fact, I had a private meeting with President Marcos for over an hour. But the joint investments that are being made all across the Indo-Pacific, but in places like the Philippines, especially with infrastructure, really crystallized because we looked at a major rail project. And there were so many firms there and a lot of American firms as well. So just how thriving the economies are and how people are trying to regrow the economy post-COVID and how much investments other nations are also making in their infrastructure.
Yeah, I believe that railway project was funded in part by the Asian Development Bank. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a bit about the role of global financing in providing opportunities for women in particular?
So the Asian Development Bank is a great example. Ambassador Chantal Wong has made the commitment that the Asian Development Bank would, by 2030, make sure that 75% of the projects that it sponsors and funds will include inclusivity and access for women. And so making that very firm commitment has been really important. And so you see this starting to take effect right away. For example, after her visit to Singapore, the Singapore Prime Minister came out and declared that they would decriminalize consensual same-sex relationships in Singapore. And so it's not just about women, it's also about LGBTQ issues as well. And in many parts of the world, you're actually seeing a lot of anti-LGBTQ legislation being passed by domestic legislatures. And so to have the ADB out there saying, no, we're going to really support and make a preference for projects that provide equal access, and actually promote that access and inclusivity is really important.
Let's move on to the Inflation Reduction Act, which you've described as creating historic change.
Yes.
What opportunities do you think that the IRA provides in particular for women?
So one of the things that I'm seeing as a path to more power, path to more leadership is the entrepreneurial side of things. Women are very entrepreneurial, and I'm seeing this not just in the U.S. but overseas as well. And so through the Inflation Reduction Act, you're seeing investments made all across the country in a way that promotes entrepreneurial organizations. And so you're seeing more women, corporate presidents and women-led firms really having greater access in order to take advantage of the IRA. And I think that's really important.
Famously, you were the first person to vote with a child on the Senate floor. Your daughter joined you in 2018. Yes. And you have pushed for legislation to make it easier for mothers to juggle childcare and political duties. I also have to mention that you were the first U.S. Senator to give birth while in office, too. Still in 2024, just a quarter of your peers in Congress are women. So what's standing in the way? And I'm curious how things have changed since you were first elected to the House in 2012. Do you think it's gotten easier, harder?
So I think in some ways things have gotten easier. The problem is we don't have true representation in Washington in either the Congress, in either the House or the Senate. The fact is 51% of the senators are not women. If we had true representation, they would be. There are more white men named John in the United States Senate than there are persons of color. Think about that. So, truly, we don't truly have equal representation at the table for folks. And so it is harder, I think, for women to get into elected office. I'll give you an example. On Monday, we had one vote and we were going to have a second vote, which was not anticipated. And my nanny leaves at 7, and the vote was at 5:30. And so everything was set up, and then the leadership added a second vote. I said, great, the votes usually take, a 15-minute vote in the Senate takes an hour. So, okay, by 6:30, I'll be able to, make it back in time for the nanny. But one of my male colleagues, and this was on a vote that was, we had already won, it was a throwaway vote, and had called in, was on a flight that was delayed and said, I want to vote on this motion to table. And they held the vote open for over an hour and a half. And I said, I'm not going to make it for my nanny.
Sorry, he was on a flight, and
on a flight
to say,
yes,
let's do this.
Okay. So we held the vote open for one person.
Okay. Was he called John?
No, no. But it was one of these things where it was like, why did we do that on a vote that we had already won, that wasn't consequential? And it was very frustrating. So and there's a lot of those types of things that happen. It's why I'm the 10th woman to have a child in office in the House and the first in the Senate. It's because it's not a friendly environment for people with young children. And for my male colleagues who do have young children, their children are back at home with their spouses who are taking care of them. Their children are not with them. Because, I got up this morning, got my daughter dressed for school, made her school lunch, made her breakfast, drove her off, dropped her off before I came in here. None of my male colleagues are doing that. And so the structure is set up in such a way that it is really hard for women to be in elected office, which is why you see many women enter elected office after they've raised their children, right? Speaker Pelosi joined politics after her kids were in high school. Whereas men sort of have this, planned pathway for many of them where they start off as Senate pages, and then they become Senate interns, and then they become a staff assistant, or their uncle or their dad, their grandfather were senators. And so you see a lot of younger men enter the Senate, but women you see, in order to run for office and hold everything together, you find that they often have had to get to a point in their careers where they've raised their children. And that makes things very difficult. And so I think, as a developed nation, as a leader of the free world, it is shameful that we don't have universal paid family leave, that we don't have universal child care, that we don't have, universal Head Start. All of these things need to be put into place so that we take advantage of the productivity of 51% of our population. How do we compete on a global scale economically if 51% of our productivity is being sidelined for the first 20 years of their adulthood? That's crazy.
And you've been consistently focused on kind of highlighting and seeking to rectify these very practical impediments to getting more women involved in public life. I'm thinking, for instance, of the way that now people can find a safe place to breastfeed in airports.
Yes.
Which I don't know about anyone here, but I've personally felt very grateful for that in the past. So thank you for that.
That's one of those things where people go, what keeps you going? I wrote that bill. Because I gave birth in the house in 2014, and I was going back and forth every week between my home in Chicago and DC, and I was breastfeeding, and I couldn't find a place to pump. And they kept saying, and I would ask at National Airport, and I would ask at O'Hare, and they were like, oh, use the handicap stall of the restroom. I'm like, well, that's disgusting. You would make a sandwich for yourself in there. Why would you think I would pump breast milk for my daughter in there? And then the other option was, well, you could just go plug in next to where those guys are charging their cell phones. If you were sitting next to me in 2015 on a flight, I was pumping. And it was crazy. So we passed that legislation, and it took me getting Republican male doctors to support me to get that passed.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. You are a decorated combat veteran, so I feel a little silly asking this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. People say horrible things to women who are running for office and who are in elected office. And Joe Walsh, who I'm not going to dignify by quoting what he said about you when he was running, but it wasn't very nice. This is in your 2012 congressional race. How can we tell young women in particular, how do we equip them to deal with these kinds of attacks?
I call it out. I mean, I've been, in my first race in 06 that I lost, I was called shrill, right? All of the code words on what you say about women, that I responded to something and they said, oh, that response was shrill. My opponent said that, Joe Walsh, you know, the last man that I defeated, also, the last several. But what Emily's List found when they did a study was that people recognize when these misogynistic or racist remarks are being made, and they respect you if you rise above it, but they respect you more and you get them to vote for you. They flip their vote to you if you call it out on the spot. So that's what I tell young women who are running, and I tell all women who are running and persons of color. It's like, call it out on the spot. It's going to happen. But you need to call out and say that is misogynistic. You would never do a reporting. You'd never ask that of a man. You know, you would not say that to a woman. That is misogynistic, and that is not acceptable here. And you say that about racism as well. And so the studies have shown that voters actually change their vote and will support you more if you call it out. They'll respect you, but they may not vote for you if you just rise above it. You have to call it out.
That's great advice. You've done so much to make veterans' lives better, and I did want to spend a minute on this too. Are there particular challenges faced by women in the military, either when they're serving or after they leave, that you'd like people to be more aware of?
So there is a lot of structural stuff that happens that we're still trying to change. And there is the same off-ramp when you get to your mid-career point when you want to raise children. So some of the structural things are, we're still trying to change the military's leave policy. For example, when I first started working on this, when I was in the House in 2014, 2015, the maternity leave for women who give birth to children was 6 weeks, including if you had a cesarean, including if your duty station was Afghanistan. So I was talking to a military aide assigned to the House who had just given birth, and she had to go to Afghanistan, and her commander refused to grant her permission to defer and take personal leave time. So 6 weeks after having a cesarean, she had to go to Afghanistan. So we've changed that now, but we're still trying to change structurally that happening. As a pilot, if you get pregnant, that's a grounding condition because they said the uterus can't handle the vibrations from the aircraft. We've changed that now. So the Air Force recently, I think there was an Air Force pilot who was flying when she was up to 7 months pregnant. So we're changing that. So if you get grounded, it means you can't fly, which means you can't really lead your unit. So a lot of women just take that off ramp, right? They get to their mid-career, or they choose to defer their pregnancy, which is what I did. And then now you're faced with trying to get pregnant in your 40s and all the infertility struggles that come with that when you finally are the battalion commander. And so the same thing happens there. The other structural problem was that women were not allowed into combat positions. And so to get into the 4-star ranks, one of the things is having been in command of a combatant unit, and women were banned from those units, so they couldn't ever rise to the top the way men could. That's now gone. But those women are just now lieutenants and captains. They're not at a point where, we're going to see a lot more female 4-stars in the next 5 to 10 years as those women rise. So there's a lot of that structural stuff, but then there's just a lot of those sort of off-ramps and things that make it really hard for women. And then there are just the basic biases. I remember showing up at my officer's basic course, and they put a picture up on the wall, on the screen, and said, this is what you should strive to look like. And it was a 6'3" blonde guy with a buzz cut. And this is how you should carry yourself, and this is what you should always look like. This is the ideal military officer, and this is what you should look like. And I'm like, well, I failed on day one. I'm a short Asian girl. I'm never going to look like a 6'3" blonde buzz cut guy. And I raised my hand. I'm like, if that's the ideal, do I need to buzz cut my hair? So there's a lot of those sort of inherent biases that still occur.
Just picking up on that idea of the off-ramps and of women delaying parenting when they're in the military, I imagine you've spoken openly about your IVF journey. Mm-hmm. Is IVF also an issue for access to IVF an issue for women in the military at the moment? It
is an issue, and we're trying to expand coverage because the VA and the DoD did not cover IVF. It is expensive, but it should be covered. And there's a couple things that are happening. One of the things I tell all the young women who come to work for me is freeze your eggs. Like, freeze your eggs. And I'm like overbearing and inappropriate to my female staff members who are in their early 30s. I'm like, freeze your eggs. You're going to want them later. And we need to make that available. This is happening with men too. So there should be, for all military men and women, the ability to freeze egg and sperm, especially prior to a combat tour. The infertility rate among military women is double that of civilian women, and it's rising among men. And the irony is that we did not cover third-party genetic donations, so no donations of sperm or eggs. Up until recently, we were pushing for that to be covered. And the only way we gained ground was when, unfortunately, the men in Afghanistan were on foot patrols and were stepping on landmines and started losing their reproductive organs. And so the only way these male veterans could become fathers was through a sperm donation. And only then did I get my male colleagues to agree to allow third-party donations. When it was just the women needing donated eggs, they wouldn't go for it. But when it's about the guys needing sperm, it's okay. And so among military men and women, this is a big issue. And all of this IVF being made less accessible in states where they have now deemed a fertilized egg as a human being is affecting men in the military as well as women in the military. And people don't realize this is a little bit of a sleeper issue in the military, but it is very much an important issue. So you're seeing a lot more military men and women starting to, on their own, freeze their egg and sperm before they go on a deployment.
Senator, I think we could keep talking forever, and I love the life lessons that you've imparted to us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
You are good. Right on the dime. Thank you.
Next, please welcome to the stage Data 2X Executive Director, Krista Jones-Batista, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Senior Program Officer, Jennifer Hansel, Chief of the UN Women's Research and Data Section, Papa Sek, and Head of the World Bank's Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative Secretariat, Wendy Teleke, for a conversation with FP's Executive Vice President, Allison Carlson, on data and the foundations of gender-inclusive policies.
Hello, everyone. How are you doing this morning? Thank you so much for joining us, those that are here in the room and those who are joining online from around the world. I'm so excited about today and about this conversation in particular. As you've already heard, this is about real conversations, about what matters and what is needed to really drive impact. That's why we're here today, because you all care about it and are working in some way toward better, more impactful outcomes for women. And so thank you again for being here. And thanks to all of you for joining me. I'm thrilled about this panel because we're going to be focusing on the power of precision. And I love the title of it as well, because it's an issue that doesn't get as much attention as is needed. And we need to focus on it more. And what is that? It's data, which is the foundation of economic development decisions, policies, investments, and it's really what can inform the decisions we're all making to drive greater and more equitable outcomes. And each one of our experts here today are working very much at the forefront, but in different ways on this issue. And so, what we do know is while data is fundamentally important, it is often fragmented, not collected systematically, not reported well, and it's often based on cohorts of men that are often driving then information that is biased and having incredible gaps. And so the question before us today is, what can we do about this? How can we really focus on greater, more robust, sex disaggregated data to inform policies? so that those policies are more inclusive and equitable and drive greater outcomes, not just for women, but for everyone. And so to start off the conversation, Krista, I'd like to turn to you first. As the executive director of Data 2X, you're a data specialist. Why is gender disaggregated data important, and why does it need to be prioritized?
Thanks so much, Allison. It's such an honor to be here today and to be on this panel with all of you. Data 2X has been working at this intersection of gender equality and data innovation for the last 10 years. And our focus is really to work in, not as a solitary endeavor, but to bring together stakeholders around the world, UN agencies, governments, private sector, academics, civil society organizations, to look at the ways that gender data can contribute to more gender equal policies and evidence-based policies. So this is the perfect conversation, and again, so glad to be here. So I want to highlight why gender data is so critical to both women's economic power and economic growth. We don't know what we can't measure. And we know that the lived realities, the gender data around women's lives is unique, and it's intersectional, and it's complex. If we think about the range of policies that governments are making, today, right, in the world, things like around transportation, time use, education, health, all of those aspects of our lives are driven by our lived realities as men and women based and diverse genders. And so it's really critical that we look at what the data gaps are. And Data 2X's research has really looked over the years at where those gaps exist and where and how we can fill those gaps. And again, this is really something that we work at the global level, but we also work at the country level. So for example, we're working in Kenya with the Women's Rights Advisor to the President on ways that we can systematically release in really important national level data sets, for example, in relation to time use. And not only look at that data from the official statistics perspective and do the analysis and the policy briefings, but also to go out into communities and be inclusive and work with those individuals in those communities so that they too can understand how data can be used, how it can impact their daily lives. And so I think what we really have seen and what we need to be committed to going forward is furthering this objective of identifying those data gaps, financing the closing of those gender data gaps, and then being inclusive and bringing that conversation out as we do our work globally.
To pick up on something that you said about national statistics and how it's informing programs. And Papa, turning to you as the chief and who's been driving data and research for gender specifically in UN Women, can you explain how and why you recognize this as absolutely vital to your work and the ways in which your work and the work of the division is really informing gender-inclusive, data-driven policies and investments around the world?
Great. Thank you very much, Alison, and thank you for inviting me to this fantastic event. It's really a pleasure to join you all. And just to say, again, I've been at UN Women for about 15 years now. And, gender data has just grown organically, and it has become really a cornerstone of what we do, right? So, essentially, I mean, we get stuck if we don't work on data. I think it has really become very clear for us, but also particularly for our country offices and partners. And again, we always also talk about the gaps that we have. But I think sometimes we also need to celebrate the gains that we've made. And having been on this journey for quite a while, I've seen the progress that we've made, and this is really over the last 7-8 years, where we've really seen, I think, gender data take off. We still have gaps, but we've gone from 26% of SDG indicators to now 52%. That's a massive progress. If we also think about the fact that we've had COVID in between, right, where investments have dwindled and etc. But I think we need to celebrate that kind of progress. And one thing that we've seen, I think, again, because we've just done an evaluation now of our work on gender data in general. And there are several lessons that come in terms of, how do you anchor this work at the national level? Issues related to, coordination of actors working on gender data. Issues related to capacity development, coordination, and so forth. Those are all important. But I think two of the key lessons that we've seen is that you really need to anchor whatever you do into national plans, right? So if national plans are out of the picture, then whatever you're doing is not sustainable, right? So, and sustainability is really what we should aim for. At the same time, once you anchor into national priorities, then your countries are more motivated to actually use the data, and that's really what we should aim for. It's not data production; it's data use, right? Use of the data to improve the lives of people. And with that kind of approach, we've really seen massive progress. You mentioned Kenya. Kenya is an example where we conducted a time use survey in 2021, which is now leading into the country's first national care policy, which will benefit millions of women. And this is an investment of what? $1 million? That will probably generate leverage over $100 million for a care policy, right? So those are the benefits that we should aim for. We've seen that in many other countries. Senegal is another example, and I can cite a few. But we also need to be cognizant of the fact, and I'll close with that, the fact that data is now much more than just national statistical offices, right? It has become a commodity. It is now indispensable, right? We are in the age of AI. This is not optional, right? Data is not optional in this case. We really need to start focusing on gender data, and this is an area where, frankly speaking, we are still behind the curveball, so we really need to catch up. But, another area that I'm really passionate about, which is, citizen-generated data, right? Which we are spearheading some a nice initiative now, a collaborative with the UN Statistics Division and others. And we're really trying to bring citizens into the discussion of data, on data, so that they can benefit from it, they can produce it, they can use it, and so forth. So I'll leave it there, but again, just to say that I think the opportunities are really limitless.
Thank you for that. You point out so many important things, including we should celebrate the gains, and point very well taken, because I think you're right, we do focus on the gaps a lot, importantly, but we do need to celebrate the gains. And I'm curious, in the progression over time and focusing on those gains, what some of the accelerants can be to those gains. And that leads to this conversation today, is what we need to be prioritizing to go further and go faster, because the impacts are great. And it's well noted what you say about national plans as well. Our analytics division, FP Analytics, Informed Policy, has been doing a few different studies of cross-country research focused on safeguarding childhood is one of the projects, and really relying on national statistics about child abuse. And the data sets are sparse and they aren't reported. And so finding ways to strengthen and obtain robust data sets that are sex disaggregated and transparently reported is just incredibly challenging. And so your point is very well taken. And Jennifer, I'd like to turn to you, and picking up on Papa, what you said about really needing to collect the data. And so in your work with the Gates Foundation, and when you're thinking about economic surveys and ways that that data can be collected systematically and at a local level and reported, so that it is, building this and strengthening a repository of data that's accessible, how are you going about that?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me on the panel. It's an honor to be here. And at the Gates Foundation, data and evidence is highly prioritized. And currently we're working with many multilateral partners, as well as all the colleagues sitting on this stage here with me, particularly the World Bank, the IMF, the ILO, and the UN, to improve gender data. To date, the Foundation has added or shaped gender indicators through major surveys and 12 million data points in 90 plus countries. And one way to reduce costs, because it can be quite expensive to collect data, is to really integrate economic gender data into existing surveys. So I'd like to give two examples. One is with the World Bank and the other is with the ILO. So with the World Bank, we're working with 13 country national statistical offices, and we're including gender data into the census, labor force surveys, household surveys, and the enterprise surveys. And the goal really is to improve and institutionalize both the collection of the data as well as the use of data to inform policies as well as programs. With the ILO, we've been working in recent programs and current programs on informality and care. So in a lot of the lower and middle income countries, the majority of employment is in the informal sector. And so being able to understand the informal economy is essential. And also we want to be able to measure care. So we have worked with ILO to develop standards on informality, particularly regarding asset ownership within businesses, earnings, access to finance, ICT usage, and others. An interesting new novel study that came out that might be of interest is in the informal sector, women's income does not increase the longer they're in jobs, the same it does in the formal sector. Men, however, their income increases whether they're in the informal sector or the formal sector. So just an understanding, if we're looking to increase the income and economic power of women, we need to better understand the informal sector as well as the formal sector to be able to increase those incomes. The ILO has built tools and standards, and they're rolling them out in different countries to be able to measure the informal sector through labor force surveys. And in the coming years, this will be transformational and have enormous impact on understanding work. And regarding the care economy, we have been working to build tools and time use surveys or time use measurement practices for also countries to measure this in their labor force surveys. We're doing this in Kenya, which will be coming in a survey, labor force survey that they'll be doing soon. And another area that we're working when we talk about the care economy, which is slightly newer and something that for decades has been a challenge for us to be able to measure both unpaid care as well as paid care work, as we are developing a standard. So at the next International Statistical Conference, ICLS, we will have a standard to have a better definition of care, and we can all speak the same language when we're talking about care and to really measure women's, particularly women, but everyone's work in this sector. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And your comments about the informal economy are so incredibly important, and the amount of work and labor that goes unrecognized and unremunerated. And so how we can more systematically understand that landscape and then develop policies to be more supportive of women will have iterative and cascading impacts throughout economies. And this idea of translating data into impact is so important. And Wendy, I'd like to turn to you and thinking about the role of women in local economies and all of our growing economies. How do you think about that? And with your work with WeFi specifically, how this data is so incredibly important to unlock access to capital, for example, and provide the resources, financial support to support entrepreneurs and others who are, the lifeblood of small communities, especially in low and middle income countries.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be here and to be able to talk about this topic that I'm really passionate about. So WeFi sits at the World Bank, and we work with all of the multilateral development banks to support women entrepreneurs in developing countries. There's about 400 million women entrepreneurs around the world, and in developing countries, women are twice as likely to be entrepreneurs or aspire to be entrepreneurs than in developed countries. So it's a much bigger part of our challenge and opportunity in the countries in which we work. WeFi is working in about 80 countries now, And a big focus of our work is to close financing gaps for women entrepreneurs. And we do this by working with banks, by working with regulators, working with financial infrastructure and others to close those gaps. There's about a $1.7 trillion financing gap for women entrepreneurs. And when we try to deploy our instruments, work with financial institutions, work with regulators, we find a lot of friction. And when we tried to look at what kind of the key bottleneck was in trying to address these gaps, data was clearly at the center of that, and the lack of data. And let me explain, what that looks like. We as multilateral development banks, we have capital that we can put into banks, microfinance institutions, and other financial service providers to provide financing to women-led businesses. We have the technical capability to work with regulators and others. But when we go to banks, for example, and we say, we want to fund you to do more work with women entrepreneurs, sometimes those banks are interested, sometimes they don't really see the business case. But generally what we often hear is, oh, we're fine, we do a good job, we don't discriminate against women when they come to us. When we actually are given the opportunity to unpack that with financial institutions and usually not look at the data because the data doesn't exist, but help them create the data and understand what the data is, they might have 10% of their portfolio going to women or 20%. And this is with, probably more of the banks. Microfinance institutions we know do tend to lend more to women entrepreneurs. They're shocked when they see that. And by the way, this is a pattern that happens in developed countries as well. When banks actually look at how much financing is going to women-led entrepreneurs, they're shocked. 10%, 15%, 20% is very, very common. Likewise, when we work with regulators, they have very good intentions to do more to improve financial inclusion. They have financial inclusion plans. They try to put policies in place. But they find they're pushing on a string when it comes to getting the private sector to report more data and collect that information, and more importantly, use that data. So across the ecosystem, we're really challenged to get more financing out the door because this lack of data. And data for data's sake isn't all that we're looking for. We want to be able to use that data. We want to be able to use that data to design products and services that really meet the needs of women. We want to use the data to understand how products are working for women, which they're really taking advantage of and which they're not. We want policymakers to understand which policies are working, which banks are really doing a good job on financing for women, help their financial systems learn and understand better how to serve those women entrepreneurs. And for us in the multilateral development banks, we're interested in making sure women have equal opportunities. We're meeting our SDG goals. We're trying to put more financing out the door. And to do that, we need to be able to deploy capital in a responsible way and make sure that our money is not just getting to one woman or two women, but really moving the needle systematically in these countries. And we're working across the ecosystem. We're very happy to be working with, for example, UN Women and the Gates Foundation on a new initiative we call the We Finance Code, which is now being rolled out in 26 countries to bring together the regulators, the bankers associations, funds, fintechs, all to accelerate the collection of data and action to support more women entrepreneurs in these countries. And that will help drive growth in these countries as well. Women entrepreneurs employ significantly more women proportionally than male-led firms, so we see this also as a way to drive labor force participation and growth in the countries that we're working in. So it all starts with data, but it radiates out from there if you can really take a systems approach and an ecosystem approach, which is what we're trying to do.
Thank you for that. And Jennifer, I'd like to pick up on that with you. And as there is, more action being taken when you're shown the evidence, you have the data to demonstrate what is perhaps radically different than what has been perceived. When you're thinking about evidence-based and results-oriented measurements and closing those gaps and these kinds of partnerships, how is the Gates Foundation focusing on that specifically and in partnership, understanding everyone has a complementary but differentiated role to play in this, right?
Sure, thanks for that question.
We are working to close the gender gap in many ways, including the financial gap that Wendy was just talking about. And I'd like to give 3 examples. One is working on the implementation of the WE policy in Nigeria, and would like to flag that they're using the Women Business and Law Report and the World Economic Forum Economic Opportunity Sub-Index to measure progress. So I think one thing is using these existing data sets to show how we're improving or not improving, as the introduction was saying earlier today, is one area you want to flag. The other is regarding the care policy. And the Gates Foundation has really been working a lot in collecting the data. So first of all, we did the time use survey that was mentioned earlier in October 2023, and that was in the 2021 Kenya Continuous Household Survey. That was then used to inform the National Care Needs Assessment, and this is working with the UN. And then that developed the National Care Policy Roadmap. And now we're working with the government and other partners, with the UN, to take the time use survey, the needs assessment, and the roadmap to inform an evidence-based policy on care at the national level. And the third example I'd like to point out is today, or actually last night, at the spring meetings, we released a white paper. So on everyone's table, you should have a policy brief. And really, it's talking about the different capital interventions that are on a spectrum, from highly concessional, so if you're thinking about ultra-poor graduation models, to fully commercial, so SMEs that get unsubsidized loans from a bank. And one of the issues, particularly that Wendy was talking about, is how do we understand the risk of the borrower? And when we don't have the data there, sometimes there is a higher risk than is actually there. And so in Africa, a lot of people, women have an APR of 70% APR, which is huge. So how do we get women getting better, fairer, more affordable financial products? And how do we get commercial banks to do this? And so one way is through more data and evidence and transparency of that data. And we wanted to flag Kaleidofin in India as one organization that's really sort of doing this in a creative way and making sure that you can have a credit history and you can show that women are, say, less risky. And we can also hopefully design better financial products depending on where you are on that spectrum. So this is for everyone, and especially for women who we know are not getting, there's this huge gap that we're trying to fill in finance. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And please do dive into that brief on your tables. And I think one of the things that's really exciting is about the tools and the resources that are available. I think there are so many that are trying to understand and learn, how can they in their respective roles engage in this and learn from, what has been learned to date, lessons learned. And so I think that policy brief is a real distillation of that. In the last few minutes we have, I'd like to talk about what's new and ways to fill the gap. Innovations that are happening. Papa, you referenced civilian-driven data collection. And Krista, I know you've been working and thinking about AI and machine learning. How can we utilize and harness new tools and innovations, which certainly have the need for guardrails as well, to be clear, but I do think there's opportunities to fill some of these gaps with new ways and new tools. And so, Papa and Krista, I'd like to turn to you in the last few minutes, and then I have a hot round for all of you before we go. But when you think about those new tools and different means to fill in those data gaps, what are you seeing that's working well and that we should be leaning into?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Start.
I'm sure we have similar things,
Yes,
possibly. But, we're already seeing ways that AI can be used to visualize, analyze, and harmonize data sets. And I'm really cautiously optimistic that when we see the ways, for example, that AI can be used to automate data queries across different data sets. This is happening already in many of the organizations represented in this room or that we're working with. And this can really help us get at this using data in new ways. I think we're at the kind of peak of the hype cycle with AI, and so I think it's really imperative and kind of urgent that we engage in this space and think about things like, as Papa alluded to, we're already a bit behind on the AI and gender data space. And so before we jump full force into AI, I think we need to really understand where the gaps are, what biases are already baked into AI systems, engage with the private sector on addressing kind of current mitigation measures, human audits, this like pairing that we heard about earlier of a human and an AI system. And then also take some proactive measures ourselves to prepare data sets to be ingested and used by machines in collaboration with humans. And really thinking about how to be inclusive and co-create the AI tools that can really drive the impacts that we all are working toward. There's innovations happening, but I don't necessarily see those being shared widely. And so that's another area where I think all of us can be working. These things are taking place at global institutions like many of ours, but also in the ground, you know, in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. So how do we make sure we're amplifying those successes and bringing those stories cross-regionally and taking multi-sectoral approaches to keep it brief?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think my intervention actually goes in the same direction. It's really about sharing and bringing also new communities into this conversation. So you mentioned AI. I think, you know, the one that I'm actually more excited about these days is citizen-generated data, right? So, you know, it's a whole new paradigm. It's a whole new ball game, I think, when we are talking about that. There are instances where we actually don't want governments to measure. We want the information to come from citizens, from third parties. And this is really about that. And, you know, that's one area where we've seen tremendous growth in a very short time period. And really different communities who've been working for, you know, for a long time in these areas, but basically in silos. So the fact that we're now able to bring these communities together, I think really gives us, I think, a whole new set of options for, you know, improving data, not just official data, but gender data in general.
It's exciting, and I'm thrilled to be, you know, ending this conversation on that note and in that spirit. And so I'd like to go to each of you quickly and thinking about that and going back to something that you said earlier about the accelerants. We are holding Her Power today alongside the IMF World Bank spring meetings, where, you know, a number of leaders in very powerful positions are making decisions and discussing policies, investment priorities. And so from where you all sit and the work that you're doing, and as it relates to sex disaggregated gender data to inform more inclusive policies in the speed round, what should they be focusing on? I'm going to turn to you first, Wendy.
Thank you. So one of the things that's been very heartening about this work that we're doing on the We Finance Code is the very strong level of collaboration across all of the MDBs. So we're working with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, IFC, World Bank, Islamic Development Bank, I missed one, Inter-American Development Bank, all to deploy this code. So at the MDB level, we all have a single goal that we're working towards. And then in these 26 countries where we're deploying the code, we're building across the whole ecosystem a common goal, common commitments to that goal, and then a supporting infrastructure so that there's reinforcing incentives across that. And just very quickly, I'll give a great example of Dominican Republic, where they've launched the code in November. They brought together every financial institution, every bank, and many of the funds, fintechs there. And they're really very, very actively, very quickly moving towards getting common definitions, common commitments to collect the data, a process for collecting the data, learning about how to analyze and use the data, build the business case in a time frame that is unusual for data projects. They tend to be slower, but this is really creating incentives and enthusiasm and building leaders who are really advocates for this also in the country to keep it moving forward. So that common vision, the common goal, and that leadership element are really critical. And bringing the World Bank and the rest of the multilateral banks together to help catalyze that and make it happen has been a really powerful tool because of where they sit, both looking at policy and private sector investments. So they have a lot of tools at their disposal to do that.
Great, thank you for that. And we're over time, so I'm going to turn in just a few words the priorities for each of you, or otherwise I'm going to get in trouble with my team for running over time again. But Krista, over to you.
Great. Sure. So I would say to continue the progress on closing the gender data gaps, as well as prepare for the innovations that are ahead of us, we need to continue to ensure that there is financing for gender data initiatives and gender data systems.
Thank you. Papa?
Yeah, I'm absolutely with Krista. Without the money, we're not going to go. I mean, we will make progress, but it will be very slow. So I think investments are absolutely critical. We know what works, but we are now currently, I think we really need to step up on investments.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Jennifer?
Thanks. In a tight fiscal space, I think one of the things that we want to think about is women as part of that solution. And so when you're looking at economic growth, when you're looking at how do you build that economic growth, we have to consider women in those policies, whether it's fiscal policies, whether, even monetary policies, labor policies. Women are half of the population, and they are part of that solution when we're looking for creating more jobs, a safer place to live, and they've got to be part of that conversation and part of the solution.
Absolutely. Well put. Thank you for your work, your insights, and for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. Thank you for having
Thank you.
Next, please welcome to the stage UNHCR Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, Reuven Menech-Diwela, and Vice President of the U.S. Institute of Peace's Middle East and North Africa Center, Mona Yacoubian, for a conversation with FP's Vice President of Research, Dr. Maisha Alam.
Hi, everybody. Good morning, and thank you so much for being here with us for FP's Her Power Summit. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to moderate what is a really important and timely conversation about the well-being of women and girls in conflict zones. And I'm so honored to be able to welcome Reuven, who's obviously in very senior leadership at UNHCR, and Mona, who's worked on these issues as a practitioner, a scholar in U.S. government, and now at USIP. Thank you for joining us, Reuven and Mona. Well, to kick things off, Reuven, I'd love to start with you, and if you could help just set the scene a little bit, if you will, in terms of, in your work at UNHCR, what are the kinds of unique or disproportionate challenges that women and girls face in conflict zones? What are you seeing, and what do people here need to understand in terms of what that experience is like?
Thank you, Maisha, and thanks a lot for inviting me to this forum. It's really great to be here and a welcome change from my daily work. Just to set the scene a little bit, right now we are talking about 114 million people who are forcibly displaced in the world today. So that's a population of a medium-sized country, essentially. So this is really just to let you know what the dimension of the problem is. And then remember that more than half of those 114 million are women and girls. And they are completely and disproportionately impacted by conflict itself. I mean, all you have to do is open the newspapers or read in the social media, from Ukraine to Sudan to Myanmar. Sexual violence has become a weapon of war. It's parties to conflict, whatever their ideology, whatever their motivations are, they see women as fair game. And we are seeing this more and more. I mean, just in Sudan alone, we responded to 4.2 million GBV cases as of October last year. So this is really, it just, I could not provide the sort of a description that really would be as compelling as just providing you with those statistics. The fact is that 4.2 million incidents literally 4.2 million women and girls. There's a human tragedy and a human face behind each one of those digits. And that's something we really need to know. And then women are also and girls are also disproportionately impacted by displacement itself. So it's not just a conflict. It's even once they have left the area of conflict, they go into a refugee camp. Something as banal as having no lights or poor lighting, or not having separate quarters for women because they're all put together with men. All of these can lead to incredibly precarious and risky situations for women. Same thing, I mean, you know, we as the UN Refugee Agency, there are lots of conflict zones. I mean, we are operating in pretty much every conflict zone in the world today, bearing in mind that there are 55 active conflicts going around globally right now. And, you know, they increase by the minute. And so we are present in all of these locations, but there are certain areas to which UNHCR staff cannot go with the best will in the world. And there, because of that constrained humanitarian access, that means that the humanitarian systems are weakened. We are not there, we are not able to provide assistance in place, and the women who are basically in these settlements or locations where we cannot access tend to again bear a disproportionate brunt of the impact of this lack of humanitarian assistance and lack of humanitarian access. So what happens? Food insecurity, they are impacted the most. They go into negative coping mechanisms, whether it's prostitution, whether it's sex for food. Again, this is not something you haven't heard of. I'm sure you've seen this or read about this in practically every protracted humanitarian situation. And, you know, these are the and access to critical health services, including reproductive health services. Again, women and girls are disproportionately deprived of this and feel the impact even more. I could go on for ages, but I think I'll stop there.
No, thank you. And I really appreciate you kind of giving that range of experiences and challenges. And Mona, let me see if you want to join in on this conversation a little bit with respect to this question before we move on.
Absolutely, Maisha. Thank you, and thanks to Foreign Policy for inviting me. And let me welcome all of you to USIP, to our beautiful building. Everything that Reuven said, we are seeing in spades in the Middle East and North Africa. This is a region that is really has been plagued by conflict for more than 2 decades. Iraq, of course, the conflicts arising from the Arab uprisings, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and of course now the conflict we're witnessing in Gaza. And in all of these conflicts, we are seeing the vulnerability of women and children and the ways in which they are disproportionately affected by conflict. So in Gaza, we've seen, for example, now the UN estimates there are some 19,000 children who have been orphaned. So children are already vulnerable. Add that in, there's an additional level of vulnerability. We're seeing some 8,000 women who are widowed. And that means they are single heads of household. And that in and of itself implicates additional vulnerabilities, additional difficulties. And this is borne out even in some of the early surveys that have already been done in Gaza, where we're seeing, for example, that women and children have, or women have, 85% of women have a more difficult time accessing humanitarian assistance than men. There are the same issues, of course, of gender-based violence in that conflict. This, sadly, is a central characteristic of conflict we're seeing all around the world. We're also seeing something else, I think, as we remember that women as caretakers often are the ones that stay behind, who do not choose to leave for safety in order to take care of elderly or disabled family members. So we're seeing this in just about every facet in Gaza, and I think it's something that we have to sort of think through in terms of what are the implications and how can we begin to address them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for both of you for those, stark and sobering, but also really important to understand comments. And I'd love to talk next a little bit about what kind of policy interventions are needed to do more and do better. And, Mona, you alluded to the fact that for women and girls in conflict zones, the access to humanitarian assistance gap is wider, right? Much wider. And Reuven, one of the things you touched on in your comments, you mentioned something as simple as lights. And, this is something that those of us that have worked in the humanitarian sector on these issues,
We say lights, locks, latrines can be transformative in terms of protecting women and girls from additional violence, vulnerability, and precarity. And so let me ask you this, and Reuven, I'd love to go to you first, and then Mona, please join in. How can international cooperation be structured better to facilitate gender-focused humanitarian support in conflict zones? You know, what would you like to see happen differently or happen more?
I think, first of all, involving the women themselves in their future, in the decisions that are being made concerning them, whether it's the past or the future. And basically, I mean, you know, all you ladies out there, you don't really need to be told what's good for you. You know it. All you need is a forum and an opportunity to be able to express that. And I think that's really what we are pushing for and striving for as humanitarians, is to ensure that women are in peace-building processes, they're in conflict resolution mechanisms, they're in all the discussions relating to economic recovery, resilience, return in safety and dignity, either to their places of origin or their countries of origin. And that's absolutely critical. And we are actually seeing this. I mean, a lot of us humanitarians are working together on some of these situations. So in Niger, where you do have a fairly protracted refugee situation, we have what are known as opportunity villages, where you have both the refugees and the host communities living together, and where we, the humanitarians, have been encouraging the refugee women and the local women from the host communities to work together in cooperatives. And this has tremendously empowered these women from both communities to actually work together, to understand each other better, to understand where they're each coming from, but actually being an agent of their own future and their own resilience and independence. So that has really been amazingly successful. Similarly, in South Sudan, we are promoting what are known as pockets of hope, and this is essentially for returning refugees. Again, and Mona said this, some of the women elect to stay behind. And so this is, again, for the returning refugees and for the host communities who never left. So these pockets of hope, again, where we are encouraging basically women to set up business associations, teaching them business skills, how to set up their own businesses, and again, achieve independence that way, and also building social cohesion as well through these efforts.
Great. Mona?
So, I mean, everything Reuven said, and I think what I would add to that is, I think particularly when we think about emergency response, how critical it is to have women's organizations front and center at the grassroots, because these are the most trusted interlocutors who can help ensure that women get the assistance that they need. The second is, Reuven, you noted some of the issues in camp settings. And one idea that's been bandied about is the need to establish women-led protection committees in camp settings to ensure that refugees or internally displaced persons are receiving the kinds of protection and assistance they need. Again, if women are the most trusted interlocutors for other women in these kinds of settings. And lastly, I think because of the trauma that accompanies conflict, that it is really essential to integrate trauma-informed practices into the distribution and provision of humanitarian assistance.
Great. Well, and actually, you know, those recommendations that you both put forward are a perfect segue to my next question, which is, what can be done to include women in peace-building efforts, and what strategies have been successful in ensuring their meaningful participation? You both touched on this a little bit, and especially as relates to humanitarian assistance and improving their condition and their well-being. But when we look to actually resolving conflict, you know, how can we make sure that women are at the forefront of and able to shape the peace-building efforts that take place? And maybe Mona, I'll go to you first and then come to Reuven.
So I think I'll start by saying it can't be emphasized enough, and you will appreciate this as a social scientist, that empirical data from study after study after study underscores that when women are included in peace processes, they are more successful, they are more durable, they are longer lasting. There's a greater kind of move toward consensus building. So it's essential that women are involved. So in order for women to be effective interlocutors, then, I think it's critical that there's investment made in women, in capacity building, in training, in workshops, in mentoring. The other way I would think of it is bring women to the table early and often. Engage them in every level of negotiation, from grassroots to track 2, or sort of informal to more formal negotiations. And finally, I would be remiss sitting here in USIP if I didn't underscore the importance of drawing attention to the success of women peace builders. We here at USIP host, for me, the favorite event of the year, a Women Building Peace Award that highlights the work of women peace builders in key conflict zones. It's really one of the most inspiring events I think that we hold here.
Great. Reuven?
I think Mona's actually said pretty much whatever I wanted to say, but just to reinforce what she's saying, which is essentially the power of proximity and really bringing in the women from the start of a crisis and not towards the end of it when you suddenly remember their presence and think, oh, they might be able to contribute something. No, bring them in right from the start, because again, they know best what is good for them and what works for them. And the other thing is community-based and community-led protection mechanisms, and that's really building on what Mona said as well, and ensuring that women have a place in that, ensuring that they have a voice, and also looking towards the future. Peace building, yes, that's the immediate sort of conflict resolution and negotiation processes, but then looking beyond that to what happens next, the solutions. Making sure that women have access, and again, this is something that we take so much for granted, making sure that they have access to civil documentation, that they have access to land and property rights, housing, land and property rights, simply a title deed that makes them independent, that makes them understand that they are a person in their own rights, and ensuring that their voices are heard in all of these different peace processes.
Great. And we're almost at time, but I just want to pick up on another thing that both of you touched on. And Reuven, when you were setting the scene at the start of this conversation, you offered some statistics to help people understand the scale and gravity of the problem. We know that we are at an unprecedented level of displaced persons worldwide. We know that we are at an unprecedented level of armed conflicts worldwide. And the other thing that's really important is that both of those things, the duration of displacement and the duration of armed conflicts, are really prolonged, right? And what we're seeing more and more is protracted situations. And so to kind of close our conversation, I'd love to ask you a little bit about, what you see are the key considerations for designing long-term gender equality and empowerment of women and girls programs in post-conflict communities or in protracted settings. When we were backstage and getting ready to come up here, we were all three of us were lamenting about the fact that so often the way policy interventions and funding is designed, it's such a short-term horizon, right? And that makes it so much harder to do the important work that you do. And so what are some ways that you think, that kind of work for post-conflict communities and in protracted settings can be done better? Maybe Mona, we'll go to you first, and then Reuven, you can have the last word.
So without being too wonky, I do think it's based on the comment you just made, Mesa. I think it is important to adopt longer-term funding horizons, because these challenges are, as you note, by definition, long-term. I think it's critical that women are front and center in the design and implementation of these programs. I think we should think more about the metrics we use. How do the metrics that we are using to measure the effectiveness of programs, are they in fact indicative of the challenges that we're trying to address? And lastly, I think, and we sort of talked a little bit about this as well, it's important to develop lessons learned from various experience and build on cross-regional experience so that we can learn from one another and enrich our understanding of the challenge and, more importantly, how to solve it.
Something that USIP does very well in terms of bringing peace builders from different regions together to share their experiences and share their learnings. But Reuven, last word.
I just want to say, when I first joined UNHCR about 30 plus years ago, I know I'm really old, but at that point, refugee crises typically lasted 5 years, and then there were always solutions found, and basically we kind of worked ourselves out of a job. Now the average refugee situation lasts anything between 15 to 20 to 40 years. And Afghan refugees in Pakistan and Iran have been there for 43 years now. And that's becoming more and more the typical situation. And there, I think, again, going back to what Mona said, bringing in the women right from the start, making sure that they're part of the programming, all of the activities that, and programs that are intended to better their lives. The other thing is to ensure that they have access to feedback mechanisms, even confidential ones, where they can actually tell you, yes, this program is working for us. No, this one is an abysmal failure, and you really need to be looking at different approaches. So sometimes these mechanisms have to be confidential, for cultural and social reasons, but that is critical because that's the only way they're really going to understand what long-term, what programs in the long term would work for forcibly displaced women. The other thing is basically to ensure, again, right from the start, humanitarian funding tends to be incredibly unpredictable these days. Not because our traditional donors don't want to give money, but it's simply the multiplicity of crises. Last year, UNHCR responded to 43 new emergencies, in addition to the ones that we were already dealing with. So that's one new emergency every 7 or 8 days. So our traditional donors just simply can't keep up with the amount of programs and the financing that is needed. And so we have been looking at different ways of ensuring more predictable funding, and that's looking towards non-traditional donors, such as development actors, the international financial institutions, and it's very apropos since the World Bank is having its spring meetings right now. But the World Bank has been a key player in this through their conflict and fragility policies and their refugee and hosting community financing windows under their IDA allocations. And really, because that is long-term funding, that is more predictable funding, and that also gives the space for us and the forcibly displaced women to actually look at solutions in the longer term, whether it's in that country of asylum or whether it's eventually in their countries of origin or in a third country.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you for sharing your insights and also really the practical strategies and suggestions that you put forward in terms of we know this work is hard, but we can do it better, and these are some of the ways to do it. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for everything that you're doing, and all good wishes as you continue to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Maisa. Thank you.
Please now welcome to the stage JPIGO Director of Gender, Myra Betron, UNFPA Chief of the North American Representation Office, Sarah Craven, and Women in Global Health Executive Director and Founder, Dr. Rupa Dutt, for a conversation with FP's Allison Carlson on upholding women's right to health.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this session. When we're talking about health, we're absolutely talking about the lives and livelihoods of our communities, our economies, and I'm really excited about this conversation to think through how women's health and access to maternal care, contraception, is absolutely vital now to ensure progress going forward. I think we can all relate to the healthcare disruptions of COVID-19, where access to healthcare services was disrupted in this country and around the world. And during that time, the impacts on maternal care were significant, as well as access to contraception and other healthcare services. And picking up on a conversation from earlier, we do need to celebrate the progress that has been made in women's health over the last few decades. Over the last 20 years, since 2000, we've seen about a third, 34%, I think, reduction in maternal mortality. But we're also seeing a lack of access to contraception, over 800, I believe is the statistics, maternal deaths per day, and those who need access to services not getting them and not getting the health care that they need. And so this conversation, I really want to focus on what needs to be prioritized to not reverse the gains that have been made, and also to focus on how to ensure the access to health care, maternal health, and contraception that's needed, and to really fundamentally underpin women's right to health. And so
I'd like to start off by Sarah turning to you. I know yesterday there was a very important study that UNFPA released, specifically focused on women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. And so, as a bit of a framing for this conversation, what are some of the key and most salient points from that study? And I encourage you all to dig into that as well, but as they relate to maternal health and what needs to be prioritized now.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today, and I just want to say thank you to my fellow panelists. And the timing could not be better because we did issue this report. You can see it online. It's called Interwoven Lives, Threads of Hope. And this is a historic year. I think I'm here as the elderly lady on the panel because it's the 30th anniversary of the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, Egypt. And this report is really of an overview of like where we have come in those 30 years. And for those of you, I was in Cairo. I was 10. No, I was a little bit older. But in Cairo, the world came together with a real historic way of looking at issues of population and development from a human rights and female-centered approach. And so looking back over 30 years, where's the progress and where are the gaps? And I think the real main point of this report is that there has been progress, but it's been progress for those who already had a foot ahead in the game. And where we are lacking is where the most marginalized people, women and girls, the ones who have not had that boost are the ones who are still suffering. We at UNFPA say that no woman should ever die giving life. And as you said, 800 women die every day from preventable causes of maternal mortality. And that is, we have made zero progress in changing that figure since 2016. That is one of the findings of this report. So this report isn't, it depends on where you are in the world, and there also are disparities within countries. You could have great progress in certain urban populations, and women in rural areas are still lacking access to very basic things, such as a trained birth attendant or a midwife, or even the lowest level health services, and that can make the difference between life or death for a woman who has a complicated delivery. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think the positive message on this is that it's not, we don't need a silver bullet here. We know what to do, and these my two colleagues here are going to be telling you we know what to do. What we're lacking is political will, and we're lacking resources. So I'm happy to continue that conversation, but go to www.unfpa.org and you can access the report. So thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Thank you for that, and always love a good visual aid. So thank you for bringing that, and also really encourage everyone again to dive into that. Your points are very well taken, and when you think about the risk and rates of maternal death, certainly there are issues in this country, but I believe around the world and in low-income countries in particular, the risk is 130 times greater because of the lack of access to the needed care. And so, Rupa, I'd like to turn to you with Women for Global Health, and you're working in countries around the world and a practicing physician yourself. And so when you think of, per Sarah's comment, ways to bring down that rate and focus on interventions that are working, are known to work, what are you seeing and what have you seen in your experience around the world that is working, having an impact, and where we need to focus our attention most?
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a privilege to be on this stage with such esteemed colleagues. A bit about women in global health. Our name says it all in a way, but in other ways, it's also giving you a preview to what is happening in our sector. So when you look at particularly global health, and the health workforce, 70% of the health workforce are women. So women deliver health, and they know best what the solutions that are needed. As Sarah has mentioned, the role of health workers, whether it's midwives, traditional birth assistants, attendants, community health workers, these are the majority of the health workforce, nurses, that are critical to addressing the maternal mortality rate we're talking about. But when you take a look at who actually gets the leadership, guess what? It's the same pattern we see all over society, and the fact that only 25% of leadership roles are actually occupied by women. We're at this summit where we're talking about her power, and in the health sector, we don't have a talent pipeline issue in the way that Women are coming into the sector. They are having expertise, yet those expertise are being sidelined. And just to give you one hard data point, that when you do have women in leadership roles, especially countries that have adopted quotas, mandating that a certain percentage of their parliamentarians, political leaders are women, we've seen those policies change. One particular study looked at at 22 countries, and when women were in significant numbers in parliamentarian roles, they actually saw a reduction in maternal mortality ranging from 6% to 10%. That's pretty significant, and there's many examples. So what I would say is that in our sector, we need to take the expertise that's there and empower that expertise, especially the expertise that's at the community level.
Thank you for that. And when you're thinking about translating what we know and the research that's being done into practice, I'd like to bring, Myra, you into the conversation. You're working at that intersection very much and continuing to do very important research, but also understand how that can be implemented into practice to address some of those intersectional issues and issues related to social determinants of health. And, picking up on the last panel conversation, those women who are in environments of crisis, who, are migrating and facing complex scenarios and need access to healthcare services. So when you're thinking about these questions and also what needs to be prioritized now, how are you thinking about that, but also how is that manifesting in the work that you're doing every day?
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think picking up on what Sarah and Rupa have commented, I think a lot of what we're talking about is a driving determinant of health and maternal health, which is gender inequality. So I think what we fund, what we decide to invest in is very much driven by gender inequality. I work for an organization that is strengthening women's health around the world in over 40 countries, JPIGO. And we have a number of biomedical interventions that we are implementing. But at the same time, we need to look at some of these social structural determinants of health. In fact, earlier this year, the Lancet Global Health published a global analysis of the determinants of maternal health. And not surprisingly, the countries with the higher rates of maternal mortality, sort of the tier 4 countries with 500 and above per 100,000 live births, have higher levels of gender inequality, women's lack of agency, much poorer, smaller health systems and resources for women's health, as well as inability to mitigate all these issues around conflict and climate. Whereas the other end, we have those with minimal and less than 100 deaths per 100,000 births, and we see that greater gender equality. So it doesn't maybe sound so shocking or surprising, but it's something that we aren't seeing programmed in our work, right? So at the same time, the same piece said, well, we're focusing on the biomedical, things like access to misoprostol or training health workers to better measure blood loss in postpartum hemorrhage. But what are we doing to address these broader social determinants? In the maternal health world, there's a common framework known as the 3 delays framework. The first delay being women's health literacy around obstetric complications. The second around geographically accessing services, and that can be very much impacted by her own agency to actually leave her house and decision-making to spend resources. And those aren't things that we are addressing. And the third delay, the last delay, is around the actual quality of care at the health facility. So we're focusing a lot on that quality of care at the health facility, but not as much on the first and second delay. And that's the type of interventions that we need to really invest in more broadly in a comprehensive way that addresses these social and structural determinants. That we are not seeing, but starting to see some work and evidence around that. One of our sponsors, Gates, is helping us to implement group antenatal care, which does do some more of this health literacy, as well as more self-care interventions. At the same time, we know that if we're not intentionally addressing agency, relational dynamics in the household and community to empower women, through the data that we're collecting, we're seeing that does not necessarily lead to sort of gender equity and balance.
Yeah, I think characterizing it in those 3 delays is such an important framework. And also, I think you point out that while there is that framework that is applicable across the board, it's very context specific, and it matters in the environment that one is in. Like you said, if one can leave the home, and other challenges that are related to, to the location. And so needing to think through and understand what interventions may have the greatest impact where they are. And so when you all think about that and think about the interventions that are working, and yes, we need more political will and financing, which I'll turn to in a second, but when you think about kind of, for lack of a better way to characterize it, I guess, the need for speed, what are some of those low-cost, very impactful interventions that can have material impacts now as some of the broader and more systemic changes are taking place? Sarah, I'll turn to you, and then Rupa.
She's turning to me because I brought so many visual aids today.
And I love a good visual aid.
This is so simple. This is a safe delivery kit that we give out in a humanitarian setting. This costs about $3. It is a sheet of plastic, a razor blade, a bar of soap, gloves, string to tie the umbilical cord, a very simple pictorial on how to deliver a baby. So if you're in a natural disaster, a conflict, fragile context, this might be the tiniest intervention that can provide a sterile way for a baby to be delivered safely. I have to tell you, just to bring some levity, it includes a razor blade, and we brought one of these safe delivery kits to the White House, and we had this conversation with Secret Service where they were like, is that a razor blade? And my colleague said, oh yes, and she started to describe, this is what we might use to deliver a baby in Sudan. And he said, are we in Sudan? So I made sure to leave the razor blade out. But this is something that's a very simple, low-cost intervention, but it has to get the hands of the right person. There can be other ways that are very effective, like in Bangladesh, we have an app that can provide real-time referrals to get a woman who is having complications to where she needs to get so she can have a cesarean or whatever intervention she might need. So there are lots, and I'm sure the other panelists have other examples. Again, I think there is wonderful, effective pieces. Again, we'll keep talking about funding and political will, because one thing we often say, especially in a humanitarian setting, if you see a crisis, right, when you watch CNN, the story is usually going to be about a baby that was delivered in some, amazing way, a baby being delivered in a tree or a baby being delivered in a flood. But when the funding is allocated, the funding for women and girls is always on the bottom. Those aren't the first priorities. And so what we have to do is make sure that women and girls' needs are always at the top of the agenda.
Very well put. And would like to hear from both of you regarding interventions, but then also in terms of support. And when you think about the support that's needed, what kinds of mechanisms of support, and when we're talking also about financing, what kinds of financing and support mechanisms are translating into impact? Because you're absolutely right, there is a challenge regarding funding writ large, and that women and girls tend to be at the bottom. But I'm wondering, when we're thinking about scarce resources and ways to apply them strategically, what in all of your experiences needs to be focused on so that it will drive impact?
Great. So I can build on what Sarah says, and I completely agree with that. But, as we talk about all these interventions, we also have to think about the people. And majority of the health workforce are women. I'm going to keep emphasizing that, because that's the reason that the health and care workforce is not valued, not supported, not recognized, not invested in. And we have to begin with supporting our health and care workers. If there's one lesson that we all should have walked away from the pandemic, is that we counted on our health heroes. We applauded them, we lit candles, we did all sorts of things to recognize them in the moment. But now is the time to show that you truly care and actually look at investments in the health and care workforce. So it's a universal issue. It applies here in the United States. There's a great resignation of nurses, midwives, and doctors taking place here. In low middle income countries, we're also seeing a great resignation and migration. But the one cadre that gets the biggest investment return is what's called the community health worker. In most countries, the community health worker is not considered part of the formal professional health workers, but every dollar invested in the community health worker, training them, professionalizing them, and doing it from a gender point of view results in a $10 return on investment. And we call this that if you give women in the health workforce decent work, it's going to lead to a triple gender dividend. I hope that resonates with many in this room that are here for the World Bank Spring meetings. But what that triple dividend means is we're going to achieve the health agenda. We want to have universal health coverage around the world, reduce maternal mortality, and that's the pathway to it. The second is the economic return. Women, when they get that economic formal job and compensation, they reinvest into their own family and into their children. We know that leads to greater education of the community and much more underpinning our other SDGs. The third return is what we call the development return, that any job that's formalized in the health sector means there's other jobs being created, whether it's in education or transport. So I make the case right now there's 6 million women at least around the world that are underpaid and unpaid. They subsidize about 1.5 trillion US dollars annually. If we formalize that, it would actually open up economic growth and help us achieve our health goals. And so I'd say let's formalize our community health workers, do it from a gender point of view, acknowledging their women, compensate them and support them and protect them so they can do their job and help really make sure that every child that's brought into this world is brought in safely. Thank you.
Thank you. And you not only raised the very important point about women being disproportionately on the front lines as healthcare workers and the impacts that they have throughout their community, but also the attrition that we're seeing in the healthcare workforce and the need to invest in healthcare workers, supporting healthcare workers, but also the benefits, the benefits that will have cascading throughout our societies. And I love the framework on return on investments because they're economic, but they're manifold and they're also social and otherwise. And so when you think about that and the work that you do, Myra, when you're thinking about return on investment, social, economic, and otherwise, what needs to be prioritized that is generating real returns?
Great, thanks. I'm going to pick up on some of Rupa's points just as a segue, and then I'll transition as well. But definitely investing in women health workers on the front lines. I just want to share an example of some of the work that I did in Nepal with the female community health volunteers, which have been accredited as sort of the heroines of health in Nepal. 30,000 health volunteers, unpaid for many years, really helping reduce maternal mortality and working on the front lines. When I was there, asked them, why do you do this work? They said, because I get to meet you or someone like you. For them, it's just the ability to even access and talk to people outside their community. But how unfair is that their remuneration is the ability to meet someone outside their community? That really just made my heart jump into my throat. We could be giving, minimal, even for us, and in terms of investments and the return on investment, minimal remuneration in terms of the larger scheme of things to reach the most marginalized that are the people that are still missed, as Sarah said. The other thing that I want to turn to in terms of looking at, again, social and structural determinants of health and the first and second delay before we get to the health facility is who are the decision makers? When we're in a room full of mostly women and talking about empowering women, it's not always as popular to talk about men, but ultimately gender is relational. And if we're talking about who's making those decisions oftentimes in the community, we have to look at how we also work through interventions that intentionally seek to transform those gender dynamics as well, not just tokenly say, let's engage the man as a decision maker. And we have seen where there can be negative effects in doing that. And unfortunately, research recently has shown that SRHR interventions have not done a good job at addressing that intentionally when we have engaged men. Only 8% of interventions have actually done that based on a review recently done by the WHO. And so, we also need to think about how we meaningfully address the broader dynamics going on, not only in the higher level policy, but also in the community, in the household. And that's something that we're often afraid to touch because we think, is it our place to go in and try to shift cultural norms? But I would say that when we come with our frameworks and our tools and our health system technologies, it's naive to think that we're not shifting culture or changing norms. I would say, wouldn't it be great if we did that in a way that was more equitable and accessible for everyone?
It's incredibly well put, and we are almost out of time. And so while I have so many questions for each one of you, and your experience is so rich, and your examples incredibly meaningful and insightful for everyone to learn from, I encourage you all to dig into all of these experts' work and the organization's programs and the activities that they're doing, because they are not only examples of leadership, but I think they're illustrative of what else can be done. And I think thinking through how we can focus on those greatest returns that will really strengthen, the rights of women and girls around the world and access to healthcare. So I'm so sorry we're out of time, but thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for being with us here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please now welcome to the stage the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, Dr. Geeta Rao Gupta, for a conversation with journalist Reena Nainen on promoting women's rights abroad.
Ambassador, so great to have you. I have to tell you, of all the events in Washington, D.C., this summit is one of my absolute favorite. You look across the room here today, the heavy hitters in foreign policy who are making a difference in gender, and the women, the next generation of people here. I'm just so thrilled. And we're excited that you could be here for this conversation.
I'm thrilled to be here. It's my first time at this summit, so wonderful to be here.
Definitely not the last, I'm sure. Definitely not the last. Ambassador, you started in your 20s in the 1970s in India as a counselor focusing on listening to girls, and that's how you got into this field that you're in today. I want to read you something that you wrote back in 2009 for Foreign Policy. It was a letter to the editor, and this is what you wrote. For the United States to be effective in repairing its image abroad, any rhetoric must be backed with adequate funding for investment in proven strategies that promote gender equality. That was 14 years ago. How are we doing on this topic?
I can't believe you unearthed that quote. I do remember writing it. I wrote it when I was president at the International Center for Research on Women, and it was my job then to hold the government accountable. It's very different when you're inside government. But I have to say that I'm blessed to be in an administration that's committed to gender equality. One of the most incredible things that I learned when I joined was that President Biden had made a commitment in 2021, March, that he would recommit to it, and he followed through by putting in place a Gender Policy Council in the White House. And that's the kind of thing, when I was at ICRW, I used to ask for, is that you need the leadership at the top, you need the right structures and policies, and then you need the money. And that's what President Biden has done so well, because he's got the Gender Policy Council. They issued, for the first time ever, a U.S. national strategy on gender equity and equality, which sort of guides both domestic and foreign policy, and involves all of the departments within the government. And then he put resources against it, because the following year, he actually announced that he would double the gender equality-related foreign assistance.
That's significant.
Incredibly,
in a big way.
Incredibly significant. $1.3 billion to $2.6 billion.
That's a lot of money.
For FY23, and that goal was met.
That goal was met.
So,
it actually happened, because a lot of times money's allocated, but it doesn't get to the right place sometimes.
No, it actually happened, and USAID And the State Department worked very hard to make sure that it happened. And now he has upped it by another 500 million. So we are shooting for, he's made sort of a request to Congress for $3.1 billion this year for gender equality. And so we have to work towards it. But as you know, the appropriations bill that just came through has cut budgets for USAID and for the State Department. So we're going to have to see how that's going to be possible.
When you look at the landscape of gender equality work, what do you find is your biggest challenge when you're looking abroad on this issue?
The biggest challenge, there's so many challenges right now. It's actually quite the perfect storm, right? Because you have the climate crisis, you have the largest number of conflicts that are occurring right now since World War II. We've never had these many concurrent conflicts. You have eroding of women's rights across the world. And that effort in particular is the one that I'm most worried about and the one that I talk about a lot when I travel, which is the concerted, well-funded, directed attacks on girls' and women's rights that are occurring globally. It's very well-funded. It's an international effort, whether that's the erosion of women's rights in Afghanistan or the repeal of the ban against female genital mutilation in the Gambia that's now being considered, whether that's the online harassment and abuse that's targeted to women political leaders and those running for political office, so much so that the participation of women in political office, that curve which was going this way all these past 2 decades, for the first time this year has plateaued, and I suspect may begin to drop. Because a lot of the women I talk to who are in political office say they will not encourage younger women to take political office.
That's so sad to hear. So, I mean, when you talk about the backsliding, you were mentioning oppressive areas. You mentioned Afghanistan. When you look at Afghanistan, how can we support women that live in places with these oppressive governments when you can't even have conversations in many cases with them? How do you move policy forward in a place like that?
Yeah, it's very, very sad to see what the Taliban has done to women's and girls' rights in Afghanistan. If you've been following their 50-plus edicts, and I just heard this morning that they're imposing stoning for all kinds of crimes. It's horrific. The incredible thing is that the administration actually put in place a special envoy for Afghan women, girls, and human rights in the State Department. Reena Amiri is my colleague. She is based in my office, and we work very closely together. And she has, certain efforts that she's trying to make happen. So in all negotiations, for example, she makes sure that girls and women are center in those negotiations. In all her multilateral interactions in the UN, she sort of prioritizes women and girls. In she's sort of come up with very creative public-private partnerships to make sure that through the internet and online, that girls in Afghanistan and young women can develop the skills that they need to be able to get jobs and to even perhaps work from home.
Because we know education is important.
Incredibly
it is
important.
Statistically proven to make a difference. When you look at data, I do a podcast for foreign policy called The Hidden Economics of Remarkable Women. And one of the things we focus on in this podcast is data, the value of data. I think it's a theme throughout today's conference. When you look at data, can you point to an example where having the hard numbers made a difference in foreign policy?
Data is so important. It's why I became a researcher. I will tell you that across the 4 decades of my career, it is evidence that has shifted policy significantly. First example is the fact that poor, illiterate women with no collateral are in fact credit-worthy. The data point that showed that women repay loans at 98% was what created the microfinance movement and really made that movement thrive. Second data point was the fact that women who are in this one, I was involved in personally through a Women in AIDS research program at ICRW, which showed that women's vulnerability to HIV is actually due to their economic vulnerability and dependency. So when you are dependent on a male partner economically, and your children are dependent on that male partner, to negotiate protection or to have any kind of leverage is almost impossible. And that particular data point, which came out of 16 studies globally resulted in what you now see as one of the flagship programs of the PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Relief Program for HIV, which has a program called DREAMS, directed to adolescent girls and young women, that sort of weaves together HIV prevention treatment with economic opportunities and job skills training. I had the opportunity to visit one of those projects, and I can tell you it is wonderful to see how women who are very vulnerable to resorting to sex work as the only avenue to earn money, or are vulnerable to men who they're dependent on, who may have multiple partners, being able to be economically independent and use that. So I saw women who had set up hairdressing salons. Not only were they economically active themselves, they were employing other women in their communities. So I think that it is evidence and data that shapes foreign policy. I think it's very important to have that. There's plenty of data that's exists that's sex disaggregated. Unfortunately, it doesn't get compiled as such and doesn't get used. Because almost all surveys will have male or female, and now increasingly they allow for non-binary, but when it is collated, it's not reported out that way. They don't do the analysis to do those comparisons. That's the tragedy. So what I think initiatives like Data 2X and others are promoting is the need to do that analysis, and then once you do that analysis, to actually use it. To use it to shape the decisions you make.
It's been one of the biggest eye-opening things for me in working in this podcast and looking around the world and the people we profile is how much data can be so transformative. You focused a lot on women's economic security, as you mentioned. Give us a little bit of hope here. Where have you seen the biggest wins in this space?
So in my office, I'll tell you, before I joined, before I was confirmed, the biggest win for me was that the US for the first time announced a global strategy on women's economic security, which had in it, and I was really happy to see that, because often when we think about women's economic security, we immediately move to entrepreneurship. Somehow all women are supposed to be able to be businesswomen.
Which is like, just having a job alone is hard, but let alone having to think about the whole structure of making it happen.
So we never talk about jobs and women's jobs in the formal sector. So what's wonderful about this strategy is it actually emphasizes the need for women to be economically competitive for jobs in the labor market. And one of the wins, I think, these days is going to be about the blue and green economies that are flourishing now, and the tech economy that is flourishing. And women need to be trained to enter into that, and the recognition and the different ways in which the State Department, and especially my office, is pushing for STEM education, mentorship, leadership opportunities for women in STEM, with the private sector in particular, is where the hope lies. I think the private sector has been the innovator in terms of women's economic participation, but can do a lot more.
How so? Why is the private sector so important?
They're the ones who have changed their retention and recruitment policies because they see it affects the bottom line. So they're motivated to do it. And I feel that public-private partnerships will result in it becoming more the norm than it currently is, to give women an equal chance to thrive in the economy.
I have so many more questions for you, but I'm so grateful for this time. We're going to have to leave it here for now. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much.
And now, please welcome to the stage United Nations Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed for a conversation on achieving the SDGs.
So what a treat to have you here. You must, in this week of IMF World Bank, I'm sure you've got your feet up and just hanging out.
Absolutely, but what a better place to hang out than with all these wonderful women. I've just been listening to Geeta, who's I'm a big fan of, and so she's set the scene.
Yeah, she has. So now that she's set the scene, we're going to get right into it. I thought we'd start out with a report card assessment of how you created the Sustainable Development Goals. Where are we right now? How's it looking?
I would love to say that it's looking great, but it isn't. We had a stock take last year, and from where we came, 4 years of trying to shape a response to what the world needed on the development agenda, 15% is a pretty poor score. What I think the good news is that member states took that to heart, and as hard as it was to get a resolution in response, they did say these goals still matter. It's the only framing that you take to the table that people don't argue about today, and we argue about a lot of things. And so therefore, this is the acceleration for the next 6 years. And so I think an acknowledgement that we've not done well, and there are many reasons for that. Many will say to you, the pandemic, COVID, the war in Ukraine, the current conflict we have in Israel and Palestine, Sudan, the Sahel, and many issues will come as why we don't do it. But frankly, before COVID, we were off track. And so important that we pick up the issues of what have pulled us back and not allowed us to lean in to the SDGs, which are so much a part of the response the world has said they need.
I love that you're so honest about the assessment and where we are. You're not blaming COVID. When you're looking to turbocharge these global goals, what are your focus over the next few years?
So we picked up what people are doing, but just not doing them well enough. I think we recognized that there was a means of implementation gap, which is about not enough finance, not enough access to technology, the trade is unfair, capacity in institutions to lift this agenda, which is quite big. So we acknowledge that these are big pieces, but how could we boil that down to countries and to donors and to the private sector that we need investments for, that they would say, yes, I can invest in that and it will have impact. And we're looking at the food systems, because we all got a big shock on food security when the war in Ukraine happened. We saw how vulnerable we were, and some countries have the capacity to bounce back, others not. That's right. So the food systems is a huge constituency of people, especially women and young people. Then we thought that has to be powered by connectivity. The era for the digital connectivity is here now, and it's a possibility to leapfrog and not leave people behind. The energy transitions, and it's not just about industrialization and baseload for countries that definitely need that, but it is about going green, and it is about the possibilities of being off-grid because you can go green and connect women. The whole clean cooking that we have struggled for decades can become a reality. And then there are 3 other issues I think are really important. One is education, and we want to transform education systems now. We learned from COVID how many people fell off the radar. But can we deal with the education skills gap? Because there are many who have gone through education, and education not gone through them. We have a bunch of qualified illiterates out there. What are we going to do? You can't tell them that they're not educated. They've got a certificate. So we say, okay, we need to retool. We need to reskill. And it's true, but we've got this fast forward because we can connect to technology. The triple planetary crisis is the context in which we live, but we must be really careful not to stovepipe the development and the climate agenda. They are part of the Sustainable Development Agenda. They're part of the goals come together. But we have to understand that we've got now a home, our living planet, to deal with, and we have to push that 1.5 degree target we have. And last but not least, you can't do this without institutions, people. And that's going to be a really important part of us getting delivery to a social protection floor, so that people are not falling below when there's a shock, and that we're looking at decent jobs. So just you're sort of boiling it down to those 6 areas of investment has helped us. It's not to the exclusion of, people will say to me, what about women? Well, for me, if you don't design these 6 investments with women as an outcome in their lives, that they are included, they are empowered, they're also participating in the design, then you haven't done the job. Same with human rights and young people.
When you look at financing for development, it remains a significant issue for countries to meet their SDG targets. When you look at developmental financing, what do you find is the most effective way in getting that financing to the right people?
I mean, I think whatever financing that we have had over the last decade, let's just even talk about the last 7 years, invariably we have had sufficient experience to get it to the right people. What's happening now is that it's insufficient, in its scale. We are drip feeding right now, and we're not getting ahead of the curve of those, what we're expected to have. I mean, we're just not doing it. It's not big enough, and it's certainly not urgent enough. So, for instance, we're negotiating a debt deal with Zambia. It takes 3 years. Which person in any developed country is going to take 3 years to know whether they can eat tomorrow? I mean, there are serious issues here about how we talk about getting resources to the people. Resources are getting to people, but they're not sufficient. And so therefore, when a taxpayer says, well, why is not this working? This is a whole lot of money that we've given. It's because it's too little too late. And you're not seeing the impact. And you will not until you do what is necessary, $4 to $5 trillion a year to meet the SDGs over the next 6 years.
I love your background, the daughter of a Welsh nurse and a Nigerian herder who is now at the top in the international community. You've come from very humble beginnings to where you are today. It's really remarkable. And you know the importance of policy. You know the importance of funding. There's a $360 billion annual deficit in spending on gender equality measures. Why is this particular funding so important at this moment right now?
I think perhaps if we've got any learnings, is that we actually siloed the spending on women when in fact it's an integral part of every spending. Having been a cabinet minister, I would look at my colleague in the Ministry of Women's Affairs, and I was to be thinking, what argument is she going to make against the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Health and the Minister of Education when they are an integral part of that? And how we pull these figures out, I think matters. So if we can be more expressive about this is the spending across the different sectors and that we're not just siloing it to women alone, then perhaps the Minister of Finance would be more inclined to see this as an investment and not an expenditure. And I think investing in what is clearly a dividend to the other half of society is really important to explain. And our finance ministers are, these are important people that we've been, at least from my experience in Nigeria, we had great finance ministers who were women. And so therefore the budget itself that was presented to the parliament was far more aware of what expenditures needed to be made when. Now that's just the Minister of Finance. I think the place that we're missing for expenditure on women is the parliaments. Parliaments are the ones that appropriate. They appropriate laws, they appropriate spending, and this is where it needs to be at. And so when we look at our representation in parliaments, it's apart from wonderful countries like Rwanda, it's just not there. So we're not being felt. Here, I think civil society can help and really push the boundaries of expenditure in women and girls.
In 2011, I had the opportunity to travel with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to the UN when he tried to push for Palestinian statehood. It didn't happen. 13 years later, now there's going to be a vote on, he didn't manage to get the votes then. He's managed to get votes to bring this up. If the United States vetoes it, the rules are it fails. They need 9 people to move forward. Do you think this is going to happen for the Palestinians? And if it does not, how do we rebuild Gaza? Where do the Palestinians go from here?
I think it's a very difficult decision, and the geopolitical tensions are clear. Never have we been in a more difficult position where my personal feeling is that we've lost our moral compass on Gaza. I think we've lost it on Sudan, in many places where we needed to take decisions that we should have. If they don't get the vote today, they will live to fight another day as they have done for the decades before. And I think what we have to be there is to stand up for people and to continue accompanying them on that journey. Just as we say, don't forget the girls in Afghanistan. It's not over yet. And until they have their rights to everything, education, health, the economy, it's not done. So I think this is another step in a very important journey for the Palestinian people. And we hope that member states will take the right decision.
You said, don't forget the girls. Afghanistan, Boko Haram, you have personally understood living there, the situation of not forgetting the girls. In Israel, they felt it took 50 days for the UN women to acknowledge the rapes, the sexual violence there. Why did it take so long for UN to come forward and acknowledge that?
I don't think that's true. I think that that's just selective media. It didn't take that long for UN women to express their outrage and their concerns. I think everyone was shocked. What happened in Israel on October the 7th should never ever happen again anywhere. and we need to bring back every single hostage. We've had hostages who've come, who have been released, who've come to speak to us in the UN. They speak to the SG frequently. They've spoken to me. We have hostages that I know personally in Nigeria. It's not just our Chibok girls, it's thousands. Thousands we're able to get back, others not. And I think that, the UN as a whole, including UN Women, did step up, and they have spoken, and they continue to. So I hope that we can do more, because we should. We need to amplify the voices that come out of the UN. It cannot just be the UN alone. Each and every one in this room is a member of the UN. Your governments are members of the UN. And it's not just the agencies, funds, and programs.
I love your personal story so much, as I mentioned, because you are a testament that no matter where you come from, there's opportunity for people, which I think there's so many people watching at home and here in the room. I came to Washington as a college student, so this city has so much hope for me. What do you say for the young women coming up? This episode on our podcast focused on girls. To the women who in their hearts, the young girls who want to one day become you and Amina Mohammed, what's your advice?
Well, they can become so much better than me.
You've got a pretty impressive background, I will say.
I've been standing on people's shoulders. I was in a conversation with Prime Minister Mia Mottley, and I was thinking, yes, I want to be like her when I grow up. And I've got not much growing up to do, right? And I'm in my 60s. But I think that for every person, you need to open up more spaces. And those spaces, you need to occupy them. And once you occupy them, don't let them go. You've got to stay there and make that place better than when you met it. So I asked myself, as I'm leaving the UN in a couple of years' time, is it better than when I came in? Yes, it is. We have 50% parity with all management positions in the United Nations. 131 offices where we had just men leading. We have 50% that are women, and amazing women. To bring women in every aspect that we can see, whether we're talking about a community of LGBTQI or we're talking about disabilities, indigenous people, all of them are women. And so we need to bring them into that space and occupy it. But dream big, and I think, life is a journey. Every step matters. Make the networks work for you. Today I look back, I'm looking at Geeta, and Geeta has been with me for decades, but we reconnect all the time. So in that journey, your networks matter, who you pull up as you're walking along, because when you're coming back down again, you're probably going to see them passing you on the way up.
Touché.
And you want to make sure you still have that connection, because everyone needs a touchstone. Kofi Annan used to be mine, Graça Machel is, and so you always go home to say, did I do that right? Even as I am now, I'm still checking, was that right? Did I connect? It's lifelong learning, and it is a continuous fight and effort to try to occupy the spaces that we should have been in a long time ago, but also make sure you keep them. Don't let them go, because it's too easy to get into that space. It's even, it's too easy to lose that space, I should say. Hard to get in, but much more difficult to retain that space. So, yeah.
UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, we're so grateful you could join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Please welcome back to the stage FP's Diana Marrero.
Thank you so much, Deputy Secretary General. Thank you, Rena. That was a truly inspiring conversation, and thank you for reminding us and leaving us with hope, reminding us of the importance of investing in women, in opening spaces, and in celebrating victories, because we have seen progress, but more progress does need to be made. So for those of you in the audience, both online and in person, thank you for joining us here today. I hope you came away from this program feeling challenged and inspired, making new connections. Really appreciate you spending your time with us. I also want to thank once again our partners, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Northwestern University's Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, and to the U.S. Institute of Peace for hosting us in this lovely building today. If you enjoyed FP's Her Power Summit, please do join us for our upcoming events. We have one actually tonight, and if you're interested in joining, come talk to me. We're hosting a live taping of Ones and Twos. It's another one of our fabulous podcasts. So please join us. It's at the Johns Hopkins SICE building in DC. We're also going to be hosting the Atlantic and Pacific Forum in Washington with the Palantir Foundation, a Global Health Forum in Geneva on the sidelines of the World Health Assembly, programming during the NATO Summit in Washington, and at UNGA later this fall. So please do come talk to us, anyone from FP, about partnering, about attending, potentially speaking. You can find more updates about these and other events on foreignpolicy.com/events. We're also interested in hearing about your experience joining us today. So for those of you in the room, there is a survey on the tables. Please do take a moment and fill those out. We improve our programs with your feedback, so would really appreciate that. For those of you online, you will be getting a survey emailed to you as well. You can drop off the surveys at the registration on your way out for those of you in person. And in the meantime, please do continue to engage with our content. Subscribe to Foreign Policy if you don't already. It is one of the ways that we continue to keep our magazine going and employ our journalists. It's really important if you enjoy the programming you're here watching today. And we have wonderful, wonderful analytics from our FP Analytics team. There's also a postcard on your tables. It's a water security brief that we've produced this week and launched. It's really important work around the critical work that women are doing around the world to safeguard water, which is only going to become more crucial with climate change. So hope to see you next year. In the meantime, enjoy your day, and thank you for joining us.